Alright, guys, Chapter 10 The Liberties of Power. The Assassination of Julius Caesar. The beginning quote: Our reasons are so full of good regard. Julius Caesar, Act 3, Scene 1. Let's begin. Some historians seem to think that Caesar's assassination was the outcome of a clash of egos. Being so overshadowed by this remarkable individual, the uneasy aristocrats decided to cut him down. As Dio asserts, they acted out of jealousy of Caesar's onward progress and hatred of his being esteemed above others. For Suetonius, what made them despise him so bitterly was his failure to rise to greet the Senate when it approached him with an imposing list of honors. While exchanges between Caesar and his opponents were often caustic, such incidents hardly explain why the Optimates opted for murder. Suetonius himself acknowledges that Caesar went out of his way to cultivate amicable relations with members of the Senate, including some bitter enemies. In a private letter, Cicero mentions the notable and even greater than human generosity shown to my brother and myself by Caesar. As late as August or September 46 BC, he wrote that Caesar was daily becoming more conciliatory toward his opponents. Yet, of course, Cicero enthusiastically sided with the assassins, finding his class interests far more compelling than Caesar's personal magnanimity. Caesar had sympathizers in the Senate, including some of the eclipsed patrician families. He had active supporters among the equestrians, some of whom served as officers in his army. But the Optimates, that highly conservative inner circle of wealthy and powerful aristocrats, shut him out coldly. All their instincts rose against him, for they understood, as Galzer puts it, that, unlike themselves, he did not inevitably regard the conservation of their inherited supremacy in the state as the be-all and end-all of his life. Some writers argue that Caesar was assassinated because he usurped power and reduced the republic to a shadow. Thus, Appian states that Caesar's opponents acted out of longing for the traditional constitution. Ernst Masson, echoing Cicero, assures us that Caesar, an ambitious, dangerous man who would do anything for power, was killed by Romans loyal to the republic. Michael Grant maintains that the assassins carried out their deed because he categorically refused to accept one-man rule. In fact, the senators willingly accepted one-man rule when it ruled in their favor, often casting about for a strong man who would roll back the popular cause. As Cicero admits in a private letter, what we want is a leader and a man of moral weight and a sort of controller. The Optimates had opposed Caesar well before he assumed dictatorial power. Even before he first ran for consul in 60 BC, they sought to thwart him during his proconsulship by attempting to confer on him a province from which he would have gleaned no advantage whatever. They resisted his efforts to forge a way to high office because they detested everything he stood for. Caesar was not just another popular re who rallied the commonalty, which would have been bad enough, but a brilliant, charismatic one like Gaius Gracchus, who pursued a broad program of redistributive reform. Worse still, like Marius, he had an army at his back, and far beyond Marius, he had devilishly keen political instincts and a deep grasp of social policy. Furthermore, he was personally uncorruptible. True, like other public figures, he indulged shamelessly in the corrupt practice of buying influence and votes, but he himself could not be bought off or otherwise lured into an alliance with the Optimates, as could reformers manqués such as Pompey. Caesar treated erstwhile foes with unusual leniency. In 44, shortly before the Ides of March, he selected Aulus Hirtius and C. Vibius Pansa as consuls for 43, and Munatius Plancius and Decimus Brutus for 42. The latter was also signed to rule Cisalpine Gaul. All four repaid him with their daggers. Caesar appointed Gaius Trebonius and Tilius Cimber to be governors of Asia and Bithynia, respectively. They too participated in the assassination, and he appointed the leading protagonists of the plot, Marcus Brutus and Gaius Cassius, as Praetor Urbanus and Praetor Peregrinus, respectively. One opponent whom Caesar never had much opportunity to woo was Cato, who breathed only enmity toward him from the start. After the defeat of the Pompeian forces in 46, Cato, seeing that the Optimate cause was lost, and unwilling to submit to Caesar, who was expressly ready to pardon him, committed suicide. Still, Caesar refused to pursue a policy of retribution against his family, keeping Cato's patrimony intact for his children. Caesar's renowned clemency stemmed from neither lack of resolve nor reckless prepossession. Rather, it was a conscious tactic born of his strategy of reconciliation. His goal was to turn political enemies into allies. His modus operandi was cooptation rather than proscription. Harsh, punitive measures, he believed, only created a toxic residue of enmity and vengeance. Rather than have the whole wealthy oligarchs skulking about in the shadows, harboring revenge in their hearts, he would give them responsibilities and places of honor in his administration. Sometimes that's worse, you know. They're sitting there, they're just too close to you. He thought to box them in. Once they saw that he was the only one who could bring peace and stability, they would go along rather than resist, giving a little to the people in order to keep a lot for themselves. But history offers few, if any, examples of powerful classes becoming willing accomplices in the diminution of their own material privileges. What seems to have escaped Caesar's understanding, we can say with the benefit of hindsight, is that his generosity was insufficient recompense for oligarchs in high dudgeon. As long as his populist policies fed the unforgiving hatred so darkly nursed by the optimists, his leniency toward them could only work against him. It is a mistreatment of history to reduce this struggle to a factional or personal feud, or even a purely constitutional issue devoid of social content. The oligarchs were less Caesar's personal rivals and ungrateful beneficiaries than his bitter political economic enemies. His power greatly alarmed them because he used it to work against rather than for their interest. Like other popularity, he attempted to deal with unemployment, poverty, unfair taxes, excessive luxury consumption, land redistribution, rent gouging, usury, debt relief, and overall aristocratic avarice. Like every aristocratic reformer from Cleisthenes centuries before him in ancient Greece to Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 20th century United States, Caesar was branded a traitor to his class by members of that class. He had committed the unforgivable sin of trying to redistribute, albeit in modest portions, some of the wealth that the very rich tirelessly siphoned from state coffers and from the labor of the many. It was unforgivable that he should tamper with the system of upward expropriation that they embraced as their birthright. Caesar seems not to have comprehended that in the conflict between haves and have-nots, the haves are really the have-it-alls. The Roman aristocrats lambasted the palest reforms as the worst kind of thievery, the beginning of a calamitous revolutionary leveling, necessitating extreme countermeasures, and they presented their violent retaliation not as an ugly class expediency, but as an honorable act on behalf of Republican liberty. Only a handful of historians have signed on to Badian's indictment of senatorial rule in the late Republic. No administration in history has ever devoted itself so wholeheartedly to fleecing its subjects for the private benefit of its ruling class as Rome of the last age of the Republic. Such ruling class rapacity rarely parades in naked form. Those ensconced at the social apex utilize every advantage in money, property, education, organization, and prestige to maintain their ideological hegemony over the rest of society. They marshal a variety of arguments to justify their privileged position, arguments that are all the more sincerely embraced for being so well-serving. But ideology is not merely a promotion of class interests. The function of ideology is precisely to cloak narrowly selfish interest, wedding them to a more lofty and capacious view of society. This helps explain why the optimist ideology carries such a familiar ring today. It contains the standard mystifying tenets of all ruling property classes throughout the ages. These might be summarized as follows. First and foremost, the oligarchic clique represents its own privileged special interests as tantamount to the general interest. Cicero laid the groundwork for future generations of elite propagandists when he argued that the well-being of the Republic and the entire society depended on the well-being of the prominent few who presided so wisely and resplendently over public affairs and whose high station gave proof of a deserving excellence. Second, ruling class protagonists warned that such things as doles, rent caps, and debt cancellations undermine the moral fiber of those indigents who are the beneficiaries, pandering to their profligate ways at the expense of the more responsible and stable elements of society. Third, the ruling elites maintained that redistributive social programs deliver ruinous costs upon the entire society. There was not enough land for small farmers to be resettled, not enough funds for grain doles or public projects that would employ hard-up plebs. or plebes, no notice is taken that there was always money enough for war and massive public subsidies to the wealthiest stratum. Fourth, when unable to openly attack popular reforms that bridle their own overweening greed, the oligarchs attack the reformers and their motives. They portray mass agitation not as a righteous resistance to economic injustice, but as class war, the work of unscrupulous, unstable, self-aggrandizing, power-lusting demagogues who, in Cicero's words, inflame the passions of the unsophisticated multitude, but really do have the people's interests at heart. Many latter-day historians are immersed in this age-old ruling ideological perspective. So the quote ends here, inflame the passions of the unsophisticated multitude. So I think the author says, but really do have the people's interests at heart. Those were in Cicero's words. Many latter-day historians are immersed in this age-old ruling ideological perspective, so they explain away Caesar's assassination in terms that are rather favorable to the assassins. They emphasize how Cicero and the other constitutionalists boasted of a republic founded on law and selfless virtue, but they take little notice of how these same constitutionalists swindled public lands from small farmers, in violation of the law, plundered the provinces like pirates, taxed colonized peoples into penury, imposed backbreaking rents on rural and urban tenants, lacerated debtors with usurious interest rates, expanded the use of slave labor at the expense of free labor, manipulated auspices to stymie popular decisions, resisted even the most modest reforms, bought elections, undermined courts and office holders with endless bribery, and repeatedly suspended the Constitution in order to engage in criminal acts of mass murder against democratic commoners and their leaders. Such were the steadfast Republicans upon whom most classical historians gaze so admiringly. As understood by the nobility, Republican liberty was first and foremost liberty for the aristocracy, freedom to savor every class prerogative without restraint and with only the appearance of public devotion, to enjoy all the benefits of civil society while burdened by none of the costs, and to grow still richer at the expense of everyone else. Whatever its republican trappings, aristocratic liberty is essentially blue-blood plutocracy, the ruthless liberty of wealth that remains to this day inhospitable to any modicum of economic democracy. Those who think that politics and history are just all about power might wish to reflect on the late republic. The wealthy class did not pursue power as an end in itself. Power was and still is an instrumental value. It enables the rich to secure and advance their opportunities to profit off human labor, exercise decisive control over disadvantaged groups, monopolize public resources and private markets, expand overseas holdings, and plunder government treasuries. Power enables them to preserve their precious privileges, their fabulous way of life, and the one thing that makes such a life possible, their immense wealth. To be sure, ambitious individuals may pursue power as an end in itself, as a way to advance their unprincipled careers and cover themselves with glory, but to see personal ambitions and jealousies as the sum total of political conflict is to rule out larger interest. Then what is called politics becomes nothing more than the jockeying for wealth and power within a class that already holds a monopoly on wealth and power. In fact, even a frenetic careerist like Cicero held views that were more than merely self-promotional, reflecting the genuine concerns of the wealthy owning class of which he was a part, and of the especially privileged and empowered coterie within that class, the senatorial oligarchs, whose matchless leader he dreamed of becoming. Throughout history, in the name of liberty, owning classes have opposed political leaders who have sought a more equitable distribution and use of wealth, and in the name of stability and public safety, they have repeatedly surrendered some of their own power to autocratic leaders dedicated to preserving the privileged socio-economic order. So it has been in just about every class society before and since the late Republic. Power is not usually an end in itself. It is a precious means by which wealth is accumulated, preserved, and enjoyed. The climber who seeks above all else to promote himself becomes a ready tool of wealth. That career path is far less risky and more rewarding than the one trod by those who champion the cause of the dispossessed and powerless. The same optimists who feared Julius Caesar's dictatorial power were able to hand dictatorial power to Pompey during the public disturbances of 52 BC. In complete violation of constitutional practice, the senators appointed Pompey consul without a colleague, so that he could exercise a one-man veto-proof rule. They also granted him total control over the treasury and over the corn supply of the entire empire for 5 years. Both these moves also violated the Constitution by turning to Pompey. In this manner, the Senate oligarchs revealed their readiness to jettison Republican principles when necessary. So they're saying, pretty much if they already have wealth, they don't need to be the face of it. They're gonna nominate a candidate who supports their own interests, like Pompey. Consider other examples of senatorial extra-constitutionality. Some of Caesar's antagonists in the Senate inquired into the conduct of his Gallic campaign, going so far as to urge that he be handed over to the enemy. In 58 BC, they attempted to promote a mutiny among his officers and treasonously conspired with Ariovistus, a German leader and battlefield antagonist in Gaul, to assassinate Caesar. In a pre-battle meeting, Ariovistus boasted to Caesar that many Roman nobles would richly reward him if he put Caesar to death, so messengers sent by the Senate Optimates themselves had informed him. In 51, Senate leaders collaborated with the Gauls in an attempt to undo Caesar, urging them to hold out for another year. Such acts of criminal treachery and treason represented drastic departures from proper constitutional practice. Yet they have evoked little critical comment from historians past or present. The senatorial oligarchs openly demonstrated their intolerance of constitutional checks when they were the ones being checked. In 49, for example, the Senate passed a decree ordering Caesar to dismiss his army and surrender Gaul to Senate-picked generals, failing which he would be deemed a traitor. Serving as a people's tribune, Mark Antony issued a perfectly lawful veto of his decree. Yet he and another tribune were then forced to flee in order to save themselves from the Optimates' potentially lethal wrath. This gives insight to the idea of, like, why do we have a Senate? Like, why do we have a Senate, or why do we have, like, the Senate has, your senators in your state have a lot of power. The death of Caesar did not bring the quiet restoration of a Senate-dominated republic as the assassins had hoped. With a civil war brewing, the Optimates and their wealthy allies displayed an unwillingness to part with even a modest portion of their enormous fortunes to pay for an army strong enough to vanquish the Caesarians. Our knottiest political problem is a shortage of money, Cicero complained. The very rich become more obdurate every day at the mention of a special levy. The proceeds of 1%, thanks to the scandalously low returns put in by the rich folk, prove thoroughly inadequate. The rich may want power, but they do not like paying for it with their own money. At about this time, there emerged upon the scene the relatively unknown youth Gaius Octavius, Caesar's great-nephew and adopted son, later known as Octavianus or Octavian. He was destined to become Rome's first emperor. Octavian initially allied himself with the senatorial party against Antony. In 43 BC, when just 19 years old, he led an army of Caesar's veterans whose loyalty he nurtured, defeating Antony at Mutina. The Senate granted him the rank of senator. He marched on Rome and compelled a reluctant Senate to recognize him as Caesar's son and heir and nominate him consul for the remainder of 43. They're kind of stupid too, but like, oh, you're from Caesar's bloodline, why the fuck? But he went against Antony, so they're probably thinking, like, you're going against Caesar's old homie. The next year, however, Octavian formed a compact with Antony and Lepidus in what became known as the Second Triumvirate. The three leaders pushed through a law granting them dictatorial powers for 5 years. In 42, the Triumvirs defeated the senatorial party in the Battle of Philippi, at which time Brutus and Cassius committed suicide. Antony, Lepidus, and Octavian now ruled supreme. The Triumvirs recalled that Caesar had been killed by men whom he had forgiven and favored with office and honors. These same men then had plotted against the Triumvirs themselves, and judging from the fare of Gaius Caesar, had demonstrated that their evil nature cannot be tamed by kindness. Hence the Triumvirate opted for proscriptions, hunting down and killing Caesar's assassins and their associates. Antony had already made a point of having Cicero tracked in 43. The story goes that while trying to escape, Cicero leaned his head out of his litter to see who was approaching and was summarily decapitated by his pursuers. So was silenced the golden voice of Rome's privileged coterie. Wow, that's how Cicero died. The Triumvirate itself eventually came apart. Lepidus was demoted by his two partners for supposedly collaborating with Pompey's son and for claiming Sicily as his own. In 36 BC, Octavian put him under house arrest at Circeii. In 31, Octavian vanquished Antony at Actium on the western coast of Greece and now ruled supreme. dubbing his regime the Principate, literally rule by the first man, or what amounted to rule by a kingship. Principate, literally rule by the first man. Damn, so Octavian, dude, is savage. In 27 BC, Octavian appeared before a senate purged of his opponents and made a great show of offering up all his powers to that surly body and to the people. Having reached the ripe old age of 35, he professed a desire to retire. As if on cue, the senate showed itself overwhelmed by his selflessness and implored him to remain at the helm. Deeply touched by their entreaties, Octavian decided to remain in office for the rest of his life. The Senate immediately conferred upon him the title of Augustus, by which he was henceforth known. It was a name applicable to all things godly and astral. Octavian embraced the illustrious title along with the additionally exalted appellation of Caesar. Octavian embraced the illustrious title along with the additionally exalted appellation of Caesar, becoming the first of a long line of absolutist Roman rulers, all of whom were called Caesar. Imperator or emperor became a title monopolized by Octavian and his successors. As Augustus, he was never again visited by a self-effacing desire to retire. He reigned for 45 years, dying in AD 14. So Augustus was Octavian, who was Caesar's fucking adopted son and like great nephew. And he was Caesar's great nephew and adopted son. Octavian became Augustus. So he kind of just like, I don't know, he was kind of like, I don't know what the fuck was up with him. I don't know how to judge him, kind of like, not loyal to anybody, I guess. Well, really, once he became power, he didn't really fight for the people, you know. All of Rome's emperors wielded substantially more power than Julius Caesar. Yet the senators and the rich in general went along with them, as Tacitus notes of their ready submission to Augustus, advancing in wealth and place in proportion to their servility, and drawing profit out of the new order of affairs. While Caesar had opened the Senate to talented men of humble origin, Augustus kept the Senate as a preserve for the rich, even creating new patrician members. As the elder Pliny reports, senators began to be elected and judges appointed on the score of wealth, and wealth became the sole adornment of magistrate and military commander. Augustus raised the property qualifications for senators from 8,000 to 12,000 gold pieces, and if any preferred member found that his estate fell short of this, the young ruler made up the difference from the privy purse. He banned publication of Senate proceedings, making that body less open to public criticism, undoing one of Julius Caesar's reforms, and he purged the Senate of those who might prove less than friendly to the Principate. It is not hard to divine why the nobility opposed the more conciliatory Caesar but accepted the more autocratic Augustus and his successors, showing no nostalgia for the beloved republic. Unlike Caesar, Augustus promoted no economic agenda on behalf of the masses. He dissolved all worker guilds except long-standing ones that were conducting legitimate business, doubtless sharing Suetonius' opinion that many collegia were in reality organizations for committing every sort of crime. Augustus manifested no interest in debt reduction or land allotments except for his army veterans, and was indifferent to the well-being of the rural population in general. Like he didn't give a fuck. The two taxes he initiated, a sales tax and death duties, were regressive, leaving aristocratic wealth untouched, all of which the nobility cannot fail to appreciate. Augustus did institute various reforms relating to marriage laws, administrative practice, and religious observances. These did nothing to ease the plight of the plebes or diminish precipitous class iniquities. Unlike Julius Caesar, who turned to the popular assemblies, Augustus bypassed the assemblies and eradicated whatever limited functions they still possess, moves that further pleased the affluent class. In addition, Augustus sought to protect inherited wealth and the slavocracy, like the slave democracy, by decreeing that slave holders could not free more than a limited portion of their chattel. Freedom for slaves led to intermarriage with free citizens, and Augustus was concerned that native Roman stock not be tainted by foreign servile blood. By freeing slaves, the owner could avoid feeding, clothing, and housing them in their less productive later years, but had manumission become too common, it would have weakened the established order of slavery itself and created a realm unduly dependent upon free labor. Augustus's restriction on manumission illustrates how the state puts the overall interests of the owning class ahead of the immediate pocketbook interests of particular owners. Augustus craftily downplayed the ostentatious trappings of power while husbanding its substance. He maintained an appearance of consultation vis-a-vis the Senate, delegating many responsibilities to that body but little decision-making power. He retained full control over the provinces and made certain to preserve his command over military forces, including a large body of guards in his heart of the capital. The subtle tyrant, as Gibbon calls him, crafted an absolute monarchy disguised by the forms of a commonwealth. After some 5 centuries, the Roman Republic, with its limited but real popular liberties, came to an end under Augustus's rule. Though certain of its forms remained for some time, for generations the senatorial class continued to play little more than a limited advisory role in civic institutions. The senators preferred to ignore the fact that real power had migrated out of these institutions into an imperial regime. The self-respect of the senatorial classes depended on this denial. Augustus preserved the Senate's dignity but stole its independence, leaving it with the appearance of authority. More important to the senators, he fortified their privileged class position. Indeed, under his rule, they grew still wealthier, though on occasion the emperor had to curb their cupidity so that the parasites might not destroy the very social organism upon which they battened. At the same time, the Senate House remained a prestigious place in which to dawdle and debate and exercise advisory responsibilities. Yeah, of course, they're just fucking... That became like the fucking... Where do old people go? To the senior center? The point to be remembered is that the senators seemed untroubled by this loss of power and by the loss of their sacred republican institutions and traditions. No furious cabals in the Senate or in any other wealthy circles plotted to dispatch the usurper. The ancient liberties of the republic, such as they were, shrank away, and Rome under the emperors devolved into a military dictatorship. During the republic, satirists and mimes readily directed their barbs and lampoons against leading political figures. So Cicero hoped to gauge popular reaction to Caesar's assassination from the skits put on by mimes. Under the empire, however, mimes and satirists had no option but to range themselves on the side of the emperor, targeting those who were in bad odor at court or sticking to trivial topics and avoiding politically touchy ones. Public debate became increasingly superficial in content and, by way of compensation, increasingly elaborate in style. In the repressive atmosphere of the imperial period, students of rhetoric were trained to make speeches that were politically safe but steeped in florid locutions and melodramatic histrionics. Tacitus, who was old enough to remember the finer level of debate of the late Republic, complained, "What poor quality, and how incredible they are in content. The subject matter is far removed from reality. It was a victory of style over substance, as dictated by the political circumstances of the day." The loss of popular freedom also brought the systematic suppression of workers' guilds and other people's organizations. Consider the revealing correspondence early in the 2nd century A.D. between Trajan and the younger Pliny, who were serving abroad as governor of Bithynia. Having witnessed a widespread fire that destroyed many private homes and 2 public buildings, Pliny requested that he be allowed to organize a fire brigade limited to only 150 members of all whom would be genuine firemen. He assured the emperor. He added that the privileges granted shall not be abused. It will not be difficult to keep such small numbers under observation. But Trajan would have none of it. We must remember that it is organizations like these that have been responsible for the political disturbances in your province, particularly in its towns. If people assemble for a common purpose, whatever name we give them, and for whatever reason, they soon turn into a political club. Trajan suggested that firefighting equipment be made available to individual property owners, and that help could be marshaled ad hoc from the crowds that assemble during a blaze. Clearly, the emperor was less concerned about fighting house fires than preventing political ones. Early in the realm of Augustus, opposition to one-man rule died out in the Senate, and over the next 400 years, no serious attempt was ever made by the senators to restore the republic. This or that emperor might act in a manner that incensed them, but the remedy was always to attempt to supplant him with another emperor rather than risk the popular challenge to their interests that democracy and an end to dictatorship might invite. Those senators who conspired against Caligula, Nero, and Domitian were animated by self-preservation rather than by a principled dedication to republican liberty. They attacked the person of the despot, but never the despotic authority of the office. In sum, when their class interests were at stake, the senators had no trouble choosing political dictatorship over the most anemic traces of popular rule and egalitarian economic reform. They seldom hesitated to depart from their own constitution when expediency dictated. Through the last 80 years of the Republic, they repeatedly invoked the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, suspending all constitutional protections by raison d'état. So common was their tendency to turn to one-man absolutism, even generations before the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, that Appian voices surprised about one occasion when they did not. Commenting on their struggle against Gaius Gracchus in 122-121, he writes, I am amazed that they never thought of appointing a dictator, although they had often in crises of this sort found salvation in absolute power, a course of action which had proved most useful to their predecessors. As we have seen, instead of appointing a dictator, the Ottomans preserved the republican virtue by slaughtering Gaius and his followers. The description Aurelius Victor gave several centuries after Caesar is worth recalling. The nobility gloried in idleness and at the same time trembled for their wealth, the use and the increase of which they accounted greater than eternal life itself. When push came to shove, their vast holdings meant more to them than state power, as long as state power was in the hands of someone who protected their vast holdings. Of course, right? Peace, y'all.